Thank you all. I'm Professor Michael Green, Director of Asian Studies, and delighted to have with us today a friend and colleague from way back when, Ambassador Dan Shields, who is originally a Japan hand like myself, and we worked together, gosh, in various iterations over the years, and he's gone on to a distinguished career as an ambassador in Brunei and an expert not only on Japan, but also Southeast Asia. So I'm going to ask our second year Malaysia student, Moez Hayat, who knows the ambassador and knows a lot about Brunei. He's our resident Georgetown expert on Brunei, to introduce the ambassador, and then we look forward to questions from the participants. Over to you, Moez. Thank you all very much.
Hi, everyone. So as Dr. Green mentioned, I'm a second year in the major program, and I do a lot of study on Brunei. So I'm glad that we were able to bring Ambassador Dan Shields to come discuss Brunei and also ASEAN. So this year, Brunei is a 2021 ASEAN chair. So he'll give us insights and thoughts on all things Brunei, ASEAN in this year. So for context, Ambassador Shields, who used to be ambassador to Brunei from 2011 to 2014, after a very long career in the State Department. In 2017, he was the Charge d'Affaires of the US to ASEAN, so essentially our ambassador to ASEAN. And before that, he joined the United States Army War College and actually was a diplomatic advisor there. He's worked across Southeast Asia and across East Asia. He's worked in Singapore, Charge d'Affaires there, worked in the embassy in Beijing and consulate in Nagoya, and back to the US Embassy in Beijing and embassy in Tokyo in the past as well. So he has a long history in the region, really understands Southeast Asia, really understands East Asia, and most importantly for us, really understands Brunei. So let's give a warm welcome to Ambassador Shields, and thank you for coming. Oh, and most important, I have to mention, he's also a Hoya.
All right. Great. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Moez, and thanks, Professor Michael Green, my old friend. It is fantastic to be back here, if only virtually, at my alma mater. I hit my BSFS in 1984, and so it brings back fond memories. I met my wife on the hilltop. I got my first part-time job at the State Department when I was an undergrad, and the Hoyas won the national championship in basketball. So after they beat Villanova yesterday. Okay, so disclaimer, I retired from the State Department in 2018. I do not in any way speak for the US government. These are my personal views. Okay, so 33 years in the Foreign Service. I focused a lot on Southeast Asia, also Japan and China. So I'll be talking today very much from a practitioner's perspective. My first tour was in Embassy Manila. I saw the fall of Marcos in '86, and Moez and I were chatting a bit earlier, looking at what's happening in Myanmar today, kind of wonder if there are any parallels, although the situation in Myanmar now is already more violent and terrible than what happened in the Philippines in '86. Moez talked about my bio, so I won't renew that, but the main thing is just a chance to lead 3 missions, and a lot of them were involved in ASEAN things from various perspectives. When I was ambassador to Brunei, Brunei was the host. This is the last time Brunei hosted the ASEAN related summits. That was 2013. And then, of course, when I was out at US ASEAN, I traveled to Manila to support President Trump's participation in the 2017 East Asia Summit, and also all the lead up to that. Okay. So about Southeast Asia and ASEAN, I think the place to start, and I won't spend a lot of time on this. I know from Moez and Michael, you folks already know all this, but just to quickly review, I think one of the distinctive things about Southeast Asia, of course, is its geography. The fact that the Indian and Pacific Oceans converge on the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea. And I think many things can be traced back to that. Certainly the waves of trade and cultural influences that we've seen wash over Southeast Asia through the years, plus the things going out of Southeast Asia to its neighbors in the region. And many times the Chinese like to talk about the voyages of Zheng He and so on, and how long China has been active in the South China Sea in the region. But it's not just China, right? India has certainly been involved in the region. First are the people who live in Southeast Asia, right? But then India, you look at something like Borobudur, and you can see how ancient these Buddhist influences coming out of India were. So I think it's a little bit more complex than China's been around in the South China Sea for a long time. Okay, then jumping forward a few millennia, in 1967, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, and Thailand, the original 5 established ASEAN in Bangkok. Today, there are the 10 members: Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Burma, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. And on this Burma, Myanmar thing, I will use that terminology. It's really confusing. You know, the problem is in '89, the then military rulers changed the name of the country to Myanmar. Aung San Suu Kyi and other democratic leaders at that time preferred Burma. So the US and other governments kept saying Burma. Then gradually Aung San Suu Kyi relaxed her position. So everybody started saying Myanmar. And now I think, now after what happened February 1st with this military coup, I think the tendency in the United States is to say Burma again. So there we are. In ASEAN, they usually refer to it as Myanmar. In any case, there are more than 600 million people there, and it's an extraordinarily diverse association if you look at ASEAN. Politically, economically, ethnically, religiously, in every way you can imagine, extraordinary diversity, I think, is the hallmark of ASEAN. I've included a map. I'm not a big graphics guy, but I do live in Carlisle, Pennsylvania since my days at the Army War College, and you have to have a map in a presentation. So here we go. If you want to get situated, I think what's interesting about the map is you look at South China Sea right in the middle there. I think that's one of the interesting things. And then the Straits of Malacca off a bit to the left. The other thing is, you know, look at the way that China, its presence is so large there to the north, but you can see a little bit of India off on to the left, to the west. So I think China and India really do very much shape the region in addition to the people who live there. Okay, the ASEAN way. You hear a lot about the ASEAN way in any discussion about ASEAN. I think it's real. You know, some people say it's not such a real thing, but my own view is that it is a real thing. I would say the characteristics are informality, consensus, consultation, avoiding confrontation, avoiding embarrassment. I think that's the way ASEAN tends to do things. I'm a big fan of Bilahari Kausikan, retired the most senior career diplomat in Singapore at the time. And he wrote in Foreign Affairs in the March-April edition. And he said, few scholars understand how ASEAN works. Its fundamental purpose is not to solve problems, but to manage mistrust and differences among its members, stabilize a region where even civility in relations is not to be taken for granted, thus minimizing the opportunities for great power interference. So there's a lot packed into those sentences. But I like the phrase managing mistrust, that ASEAN is largely about managing mistrust. And I'll come back to that a bit later in the presentation. Okay, in terms of US-China dynamics, I think ASEAN's game is to navigate that. As Bilahari said, Southeast Asia is the epicenter of competition between China and the United States. As the ASEAN leaders say again and again, they don't want to take sides. There are 2 ASEAN states, Thailand and the Philippines, that are US allies. Singapore, of course, provides enormous logistical support for the US, particularly the US Navy, with Com Log Westpac in Sembawang, a Singapore facility the US Navy gets to use. Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, all have significant US ties and others in the region as well. But none of the ASEAN states want to line up against China, right? China is too big, too strong, too rich, too close. It doesn't make any sense if you're sitting in ASEAN to line up against China. So I just think that's reality. And I'll quote Bilahari again. He's quoting an unnamed Vietnamese diplomat. I have a guess who it is, but I'm not going to rat him out here. But this line of every Vietnamese leader must get along with China. Every Vietnamese leader must stand up to China. And if you can't do both at the same time, you don't deserve to be leader. And I think that's very true for Vietnam. I think it's true for Southeast Asia. I think it's becoming true for the world. I think U.S. president would do well to follow that advice from Bilahari Kausikan. Okay, a key to ASEAN influence, in my view, is its ability to host summits. Its convening authority, if you will. So you have the ASEAN 10 countries, right? And then think of it as concentric rings. The ASEAN +3, that brings in China, Japan, the Republic of Korea. By the way, a lot of ASEAN briefings really die at this point. When you start getting into the concentric rings, at least my eyes usually glaze over, but I'll try to avoid that fate for you. Then the next ring, the ASEAN plus 6. So that's the plus 3 plus Australia, India, and New Zealand. Then the next layer you might think of as ASEAN plus 8. So ASEAN plus 6, and then add Russia and the United States. So as I talked about, ASEAN, the chair in a given year, hosts these meetings, and the leaders can come together for that. But the power of it is in the lead up to that. And Michael Green has worked on these many times, and you get that buildup, right, where you have the ministers, or in the United States case, secretaries, cabinet secretaries, going out, visiting, and laying the groundwork for the leaders to meet. That's how things get done, and that's a lot of the power of ASEAN's summit hosting authority. Okay, one other thing about ASEAN meetings, this is not really a summit, but there is also the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ARF, and that involves 27 governments. The thing that's quite unusual about that is it includes North Korea, the DPRK. So it can be kind of alarming, you know, when a Secretary of State goes out, I think the reaction is, what, the North Koreans are here? What are they doing here? And then people start to worry, does that mean there's going to be a summit that's built in that brings together the leaders? No, in the case of the ARF, it stops at the foreign ministers level. That's as high as it goes. But in any case, I think ASEAN is at the center of this process of convening summits. I wanted to share some photos. Mo suggested I add some photos. So this is when I greeted Secretary Mattis when he flew into Clark in the Philippines for the ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting Plus in 2017, ADMM Plus. So there's one shot that gives a little flavor. Here's another one. Maybe some of you might recognize Susan Thornton, who for a long time was our acting assistant secretary for EAP. She's kind of in the middle there, over the A in the middle. And then to her left, that's Patrick Murphy, who's now our ambassador in Cambodia. And there I am. There's a North Korean flag, if you notice. Off. Generally, you don't want to be in too many pictures with the North Korean flag in the picture, but in this case, it's okay. So that's basically the U.S. team that was working on the ARF in 2017. Okay, ASEAN centrality. This is kind of what I would ask you to take away from the presentation, is this concept of ASEAN centrality. People talk about it all the time, ASEAN centrality. I don't know what the official definition is, but the reality is, it's this idea that ASEAN ought to be at the center of regional arrangements, security arrangements, economic arrangements. And the sort of corollary of this principle is that there shouldn't be other centers. So in a way, it's a strange idea, right? Why should ASEAN be at the center? You have the United States involved in the Indo-Pacific region. You have China involved in the Indo-Pacific region. Why should ASEAN be at the middle? And I think it's exactly why they should. It's because if you had a China-centered region, the United States would feel very uncomfortable and uneasy. If you had a US-centered region, China would feel very uncomfortable, very uneasy. But if it's ASEAN, it's reassuring to everybody. Everybody feels pretty comfortable with that. And that's what makes the whole process work. But so I think ASEAN centrality is a good thing. Everybody accepts it, nobody rejects it. But you have to watch out for it, because people like you doing an MA program at a place like Georgetown, you know, I think it's a natural thing for you to think about big strategic ideas for the region. And an example of something like that in 1989, when Australia essentially invented APEC. But then in 2008, when Australia introduced some big ideas about an Asia-Pacific community, they ran into a buzzsaw, because this idea of ASEAN centrality had become more established by then. And so Singaporeans and others really went after this idea, because they said, ASEAN wasn't consulted. We haven't bought into this, and it went nowhere. So watch out for that. I think if you develop a big strategic idea, think about how to engage with ASEAN centrality, how to make use of it for your own purposes. And I think this is actually a very relevant issue for the Quad, this U.S., Australia, India, Japan cooperation. I'm really happy to see this summit of the Quad leaders, but we need to be careful to not run into the ASEAN centrality buzzsaw, to talk a lot with ASEAN and figure out how the Quad and ASEAN can coexist peacefully and productively. Okay, next point, there are built-in tensions in ASEAN over the South China Sea issue. And what I mean here is, on the one hand, it's widely accepted that the South China Sea issue is a matter that between the claimants, right? Particularly the claim side of it, right? None of the claimants wants others to interfere in claims issues. But at another level, the SCS is obviously also important to the non-claimants. Look at Singapore, for example. If you look at the history of Singapore, it really built itself over the years as this center for shipping and trade through the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea. So if the South China Sea were ever closed, it would have a devastating impact on Singapore, even though Singapore is not a claimant. So you have that tension between claimants and non-claimants. And in terms of ASEAN, you have the 4 SCS claimants: Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. But as I said, non-claimants have their own interests. So the way that ASEAN deals with it is, when they're discussing the issue as a block, they focus on conduct issues and not claims issues. So they talk about things like international law, 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, those principles, and ASEAN as a block stays out of the claims issues. Okay, 2016. I think 2016 is actually a pretty critical year in terms of looking at how ASEAN handles the South China Sea. Because before 2016, I think it was pretty predictable where the various ASEAN states would be. The Philippines would take a pretty hard line in dealing with China on South China Sea claims and other issues. Vietnam would also take a pretty hard line. Brunei and Malaysia would take a pretty soft line. I mean, they would stand to their principles, but in terms of the rhetoric, in terms of the tone, it was much softer. And so back in that pre-2016 dynamic, in 2013, the Philippines brought the international arbitration case that I'm sure you've all read about. And China, of course, shunned the process, citing their historical claims and their 9-dash line map, whatever that means. But then I think the key change came in May 2016 when President Duterte got elected in the Philippines. And he shifted the approach, right? He said he's going to prioritize good relations between the Philippines and China. But it was after that that the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruled on the case, basically gave the Philippines everything it asked for. China rejected this. But what President Duterte did was basically downplay, right? Instead of making a big issue out of this, he just downplayed it and said, let's focus on good relations between Philippines and China. So I think that's why 2016 was such an important year. And that's why I think it makes sense to talk about a post-2016 era in ASEAN. I would say there's been a kind of status quo that's been maintained in the region in this post-2016 era. Okay. Now, with regard to who drives the ASEAN agenda, so ASEAN has its secretariat. They have an able leader in the Secretary General, Lim Jo Koy of Brunei. It's interesting this year that the Secretary General is from Brunei, and Brunei is the chair as well. They have very talented people at the Secretariat. When I was out in Jakarta, I really enjoyed working with them, and any of you have had the opportunity to interact with them. They have really good people at the Secretariat. But the thing is, there's only a couple hundred of them. So last time I checked, it was about 300 professional staff. They organize over 1,000 meetings a year. So that's all they can do. They literally don't have time to do anything else. And another factor, aside from personnel limitations, they have resource limitations, because the principle in ASEAN is contributions are supposed to be equal, right? So whoever the least developed economy is in ASEAN, you look at what they can contribute to ASEAN, multiply that by 10, and that's what ASEAN has, okay? That's their resources. So in this context of limited personnel, limited resources, the ASEAN Secretariat is not able to drive a substantive agenda. So by default, who gets to drive the agenda? It's the chair. The chair sets the agenda. It has, quote, has the pen in drafting statements. And so what that means is the chair is supposed to consult with the others. They're supposed to try to build consensus. But in the end, the chair has to decide what's going to go into the statement or the communique. And that's not only for the ASEAN 10 meetings, right? That's also for these broader summits like the East Asia Summit that involves the United States and China. In terms of how the chairmanship rotates, it's among the 10 ASEAN countries. A non-ASEAN country is never the chair. And it basically follows alphabetical order, but there are exceptions. The typical exception would be one country is supposed to host both the ASEAN meetings and the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation APEC meetings the same year. That's too much. So they'll trade ASEAN years with somebody else. So that's why it doesn't always follow the alphabetical rotation. Also, by the way, it's in English, right? ASEAN's common working language is English. There is no other common language in ASEAN. Okay, so let's go to part 2 of my presentation. This is about, this is a 3-part presentation, by the way, so we're going into part 2 about Brunei's leadership. So Brunei is the 2021 chair and host. The meetings are probably going to be virtual. Everything I'm hearing is it's going to be virtual meetings this year. The theme is we care, we prepare, we prosper. ASEAN always has some theme that sounds kind of like that. As I mentioned, 2013 was the last time that Brunei chaired. At that time, we were accomplishing a lot in U.S.-Brunei relations, but then we kind of ran into a brick wall when President Obama was supposed to come out. And then, if you may remember, 2013, there was a U.S. government shutdown. Senator Cruz was in the middle of the action. The government got shut down. So 4 days before President Obama was supposed to fly in for the East Asia Summit, we had to cancel. So that was a big blow. And by the way, it's just a reminder, if people think that our domestic political problems, challenges don't affect our diplomacy, there's a great counterexample because, you know, we had done a lot of work. We had to build up the relationship, but we really lost momentum with that government shutdown and President Obama being unable to come. Okay, another thing about 2013 when Brunei was the chair, Brunei basically had to clean up a mess from 2012 when Cambodia was the chair. So Cambodia came under a lot of pressure from somebody, and you can all guess who it might be, but essentially it was over the question of ASEAN reiterating in its statements traditional ASEAN positions on the South China Sea. And basically the Cambodians became convinced that it made sense not to even issue the traditional communique of the foreign ministers, just not issue it at all, rather than reaffirm traditional positions, ASEAN positions on the South China Sea. This is the first time in the history of ASEAN that ASEAN had failed to issue that communique. So all hell broke loose, and the Indonesians, as the informal leaders of ASEAN, kind of stepped in to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And we're pretty successful and even managed to get Cambodian support for a reiteration of ASEAN positions on South China Sea. So Brunei got things back to normal in 2013. But you know, Brunei in 2021 is a different place than Brunei in 2013. At that time, frankly, Brunei did not need China for much because you know the Brunei economy at that time really largely revolved around exporting liquid natural gas, LNG, from its exclusive economic zone under the South China Sea, putting it on ships, sending it to Japan. That was really what the economy was about in Brunei. And China just wasn't much of a factor. In recent years, however, China has become a factor in the Brunei economy. And the way that China has done that is by investing in Brunei. It's a Chinese company that has a refinery in Brunei. And this is helping Brunei achieve its objective of diversifying its economy. And nobody else was willing or able to do it. It's hard to get foreign companies to invest in a small economy like Brunei's. The FDI, there are exceptions like Singapore, right? That's pretty small, but it's just so attractive as a regional hub that people will put their foreign investment there. But in general, they want to put their foreign investment in big markets, right? Like China or India or something. So it's hard for Brunei, but the Chinese were able to step up and make that investment, which is important for Brunei. Also, they have a strategic cooperative partnership, which includes an element of defense cooperation. So it's a bit different. Brunei 2021 is different than Brunei 2013. Before we leave 2013 altogether, here's a picture of Secretary Clinton at the time in 2013. She was out there with His Royal Highness Prince Mohammed, who was the foreign minister at the time of Brunei, and they are launching the Brunei US English Language Enrichment Project for ASEAN. That was a 5-year, $25 million project completely funded by Brunei to raise the level of English all around ASEAN. It was a great program, but sadly it has wrapped up now. Okay, so in terms of Brunei's interests and values, of course I have to be careful here, right? I don't speak for the U.S. government. I certainly don't speak for the government of Brunei. But my own view is that Brunei's national interests have not changed. Although there has been evolution in Brunei-China relations, basic national interests are still the same. The fundamental thing is just no way in or out of Brunei by sea except through the South China Sea. So there are a couple ASEAN countries that are like that. Vietnam is actually the same. That's the only way in or out, by sea. So as a result, the SCS is Brunei's economic lifeline, particularly the exclusive economic zone, the EEZ. Brunei does not occupy any SCS maritime features, unlike the others. You see all these satellite images, these wonderful satellite images that CSIS has put out of, what China's done to build up these artificial islands in the South China Sea. Brunei doesn't do any of that stuff. Okay, politically, Brunei is a Malay Islamic monarchy. The Sultan is the absolute ruler. But I think preserving the whole system in Brunei does depend on maintaining Brunei's autonomy and prosperity. And in my view, that means maintaining Brunei control over its EEZ. So I think that's the bottom line in terms of how Brunei will pursue its national interests. On religious matters, I think everybody's read about or heard about this issue about the Sharia penal code. So back in 2014, Brunei made the decision to move toward phased introduction of a Sharia penal code. This attracted international criticism, including from the US government, focused on religious freedom and human rights, especially for LGBTQ people. So there was a lot of churning in Brunei about how to deal with this situation. And then finally in 2019, the Sultan announced that Brunei would extend to Sharia law cases Brunei's existing de facto moratorium on capital punishment and common law cases. So that's where that issue stands today. Okay, but looking at the broader picture, I think Brunei has a very long history of preserving its existence by balancing outside powers. In 1984, Brunei became fully independent from the UK, immediately joined ASEAN. It's cherished that relationship with its ASEAN partners. In 2009, Brunei and Malaysia did something quite interesting in the South China Sea, where they settled their offshore territorial dispute. And the way they did it was through an exchange of letters. So I haven't seen what the letters say. It hasn't been publicly disclosed as far as I know. But the basic idea, the basic principle involved was something that the oil and gas industry calls unitization. So if you have a dispute over an area where there are resources, the idea of unitization is you essentially draw a circle around the disputed area and then agree on some formula to split the resources that are found there, 50-50, 60-40, whatever it is. And that's unitization. And that's actually a way that the whole South China Sea issue could, in theory, be resolved if this were all about economics and resources. But in reality, of course, there's a heavy, heavy political component to the issue, in my opinion. So I think Brunei Diplomacy 2021 will continue to strive to balance. Brunei will support 1982 UNCLOS and international law. Brunei will work to hold ASEAN together. Brunei will cooperate with China and avoid antagonizing it. But I don't think Brunei will give away the store to the Chinese in the South China Sea or anywhere. I think Brunei will also work to keep other powerful players, including the United States, engaged in the region. Okay, a key challenge for this year for Brunei is this ASEAN-China South China Sea Code of Conduct, or COC. So Brunei is interesting because they have skin in the game, as they say, as a claimant. A COC has been under consideration since 2002, back when the less ambitious Declaration of Conduct, or DOC, was agreed between China and ASEAN. And there are some signs that China wants to wrap up the COC this year. They've often talked about trying to conclude it in 2021, or indirect formulations that say, in effect, 2021. And possibly, because I think this is a largely political issue, possibly 2021 might be significant to China because of the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the party in Shanghai in 1921. Maybe that's why, I don't know for sure. But in any case, Premier Li Keqiang publicly called for ASEAN to wrap up the COC negotiations in 2021. But reading the Brunei press, the Foreign Minister too, Dato Erwan, said publicly that a COC is unlikely to be concluded in 2021, given the difficulty of conducting sensitive diplomatic negotiations in person during a pandemic. So I don't think this has been very widely reported. It's certainly in the Brunei press, but for people who think that a COC is going to get done this year, I don't think so, personally. Okay, the other thing, as we touched on in the beginning, as the chair, Brunei is going to have to deal with the coup in Burma or Myanmar. And of course, Brunei is not going to solve the problem, but they are the formal regional leaders, so they have to do something about it. And for Brunei, like all the ASEAN countries and many developing countries, anybody that's basically a member of the non-aligned movement, this idea of avoiding taking positions on internal matters, it's a big thing. It's something that tends to drive them. But here's a case where avoiding interfering in internal matters and preserving and strengthening ASEAN are really in conflict. So I think here ASEAN, or Indonesia's role as the informal leader of ASEAN will be very important. And the people in Myanmar do tend to listen more, in my experience, to the Indonesians than to many others on these kinds of sensitive issues. So in this context, the ASEAN foreign ministers met virtually on March 2. They expressed their concern about the situation in Myanmar, called on all parties to refrain from instigating further violence. But, it's that kind of a thing, restrained all parties. It's not what we would consider a really strong statement. And then, as you see, they said, we also heard some calls for the release of political detainees and so on. So that's a very ASEAN-like document. But I think it highlights the degree to which this is going to be the big challenge for ASEAN this year, is figuring out how to proceed on that, not letting the problems in Myanmar drag ASEAN down. Okay, another challenge, moving ahead on COVID-19. And as Moaz has written, Brunei's done a really good job in terms of handling public health issues during the pandemic. I know when I was ambassador out there, I sat through these seminars on public health in Brunei, and at the time I didn't think it was terribly interesting, but I'm sure interested now. And they have a great public health system, and they've really taken this seriously. And so people in Brunei were quite lucky that their government had paid attention to that before the pandemic hit. And in terms of vaccines, Brunei, this is very Bruneian. They're going to find safe and effective vaccines from a variety of arrangements. They'll get them from everybody. They'll take it from China. They'll take it from COVAX. They'll get it from the United States. They'll work with everybody on the vaccines. So separately, another thing that Brunei is going to have to deal with is China has proposed upgrading China's existing strategic partnership with ASEAN to a comprehensive strategic partnership. There's a good diplomat article about that, and basically it raised the right questions. What does comprehensive mean? How does this relate to tensions in the South China Sea? And how will ASEAN's other partners react? So my guess is that ASEAN will proceed slowly and cautiously on that issue. Okay, so to sum up in terms of the outlook for Brunei's 2021 year, they'll be at the center of diplomacy on all these issues. We've got to keep an eye on terrorism, right? That's quiet now, but you never know when that issue can pop up again. The Rohingya issue, same thing. That's far from resolved. So Brunei, with their agenda-setting authority and the power of the pen, will shape what gets done and what doesn't get done. Don't hold your breath waiting for substantive breakthroughs. But again, as Bill Harry-Costigan said, that's probably not the point. Just to reiterate, ASEAN's fundamental purpose is not to solve problems, but to manage mistrust and differences among its members. So I think that Brunei will advance ASEAN's fundamental objectives. Okay, and then I'll quickly blow through this third part to leave a little time for Q&A before we wrap up. But this is about U.S. engagement with ASEAN. So President Biden, Secretary Blinken have all made it clear that diplomacy is back at the center of U.S. foreign policy. My own view, key area to focus on here is U.S.-ASEAN engagement. There's a long history. The United States has been an ASEAN dialogue partner since 1977. As discussed in meetings, are probably going to be virtual this year. So the usual question of, is the president going to fly out for the East Asia Summit? We probably don't have to worry about that yet. But once the pandemic conditions ease, then this question of, are senior U.S. leaders president, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, are they going to take the time to go out to these meetings? And I strongly urge that they do once pandemic conditions permit. Also, we don't have ambassadors in place. We don't have an ambassador in Brunei because of the sad passing away of Matt Matthews, the late Matt Matthews. And we don't have an ambassador at the U.S. mission to ASEAN. And that one, it's just because the Trump administration never sent one out. That's why I was out of Sharjah for 6 months, and a series of other Sharjahs have handled the situation there. But I mean, that's really got to change. We need to get ambassadors in place there. So there's a challenge for the Biden administration, among many others, to try to sort out. Okay, I think the biggest challenge for the United States and ASEAN, again, it's going to be Burma, Myanmar. Everybody wants to see Burma, Myanmar move to civilian government, at least in the United States and ASEAN, in my view, except maybe the generals in Myanmar, they probably don't want that. But, and everybody's probably willing to use positive incentives, right, to help move them in that direction. The clash is likely to come over negative incentives, right? Sanctions, those kind of things. United States, that's what we do, right? We will try to step up that kind of pressure. ASEAN hates that. ASEAN will resist that. And so I think the challenge for the United States and ASEAN will be to try to find effective ways to press for change, but not to do it in a way that prevents the United States and ASEAN from working together. And it's pretty hard because ASEAN hates it if the United States says, we'll work with 9 of you, but that 10th guy, they can't participate. That's crazy. So that, anyhow, I think that's going to be a challenging point for U.S.-ASEAN relations. Okay, in terms of the big picture, I think the basic U.S. approach should be to help the region keep its options open and avoid being overly dependent on any external power. And that's not a hard sell. I think people in the region get that. And again, I'll quote Bilahari Kausikan. Southeast Asia has always been a strategic crossroads where the interests of the great powers intersect and sometimes collide. It is naturally a multipolar region, never under the sway of a single external power, except in the brief period of Japanese occupation during World War II. When I read that, I thought, seriously, never? You know, it's a long time, never's a long time. But I can't really think of an exception to that rule that Bilahari has proposed there. The only time I can think of that one power really controlled all of Southeast Asia was Imperial Japan for a brief time during World War II. But if anybody has any thoughts on that? But I think there's this sense that China's on the move, and it's almost inevitable that China's going to overshadow Southeast Asia. But I would argue that this perspective kind of points in the other direction, that maybe the Southeast Asians themselves and their friends can keep options open until the alignment shifts a bit. So that's the direction in which I lean. Okay, I certainly welcome this U.S. engagement with Australia, India, and Japan, the Quad. These reports of a virtual summit, I think that's fantastic. But as hinted at earlier, I think the thing that Quad has to watch out for is not to run afoul of ASEAN centrality. The Quad needs to be talking to the chairs. It's going to be Brunei in 2021, Cambodia, this will be challenging in 2022, Indonesia in 2023, that's a strong chair, and then Laos in 2024. So the Quad and the individual countries in the Quad need to be talking to these ASEAN chairs. We should see what they want, see how we can help them. And it needs to be multi-dimensional, right? We tend to focus right in on South China Sea and freedom of navigation operations and those kind of things. And those things are all critically important, but it can't all be about that, right? We need to focus on other things as well. Economic integration, maritime cooperation, emerging leaders, the Young Southeast Asian Leadership Initiative, YSEALI, which is just a fantastic program. Opportunity for women, transnational challenges. And under transnational challenges, the ones I like are cooperation on health and vaccine. I understand the Quad, according to the press reports, they're talking about vaccines and so on. What can Quad partners, what can India do to help Southeast Asia in terms of addressing its vaccine challenges? So I think that's a critical area. And also demographic changes. There are a lot of countries in the region that suffer with this aging population problem. I think that affects the whole EAS region, although there are pockets of demographic vibrancy. And that affects supply chains and so on. So I think we should be having a dialogue about these demographic issues. Those are just my personal opinions. And then finally, just gratuitous little shot with me greeting His Majesty the Sultan back in 2013. So, okay, well, that concludes my presentation. And at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Michael and Moez to play MC. Thank you very much.
Terrific, Ambassador Shields. Thank you. I think we can stop sharing screen so everyone can see the ambassador.
Let me do that.
Listening to your presentation, by the way, it was terrific. And we one of our first, the Asian Studies Masters at Georgetown is only about 8 years old, but one of our early graduates was a Bruneian diplomat who's now working for the Prime Minister.
Oh, fantastic.
And so we have a little bit of a special relationship with Brunei, we feel like. Listening to your presentation, I thought, if you're an ambassador in ASEAN, the bad news is Washington doesn't pay attention a lot. But then I thought, the good news is Washington doesn't pay attention a lot. So you must have had, it sounds like an awful lot of latitude that the ambassador for, say, in China or Korea or Japan wouldn't have.
Yes.
So that part must have been incredibly fun and rewarding. I wanted to, real quick, just ask you the first question, then I'll let Moez and others can ask through the Q&A session. So, what, it's hot off the press, and it is only just coming out. I got a little bit of advanced briefing, so I wrote a piece for Foreign Policy about it. But the Quad announced today that they're going to provide 1 billion vaccines to Southeast Asia. So that stuff about India, so Indian manufacturing, Japanese funding, American Johnson & Johnson, patents, and Australian logistics. So if when you were saying the Quad has to be careful, first question for you is, does that meet the Dan Shields test of credibility for the Quad? I'd be interested in what your reaction is.
Oh, that's fantastic. I hadn't heard that news yet, and that's exactly the kind of thing I was hoping the Quad would do. So I love that. I think that's great. I do still think the Quad needs to tread carefully. I mean, that kind of thing nobody can have any problem with. But anything that gets more sensitive, more political, talking a lot with the chairs and then trying to roll things out in coordination with ASEAN, I think would be a very smart approach for the Quad going forward.
The Quad has been, the Quad started when I was in the White House, 2004 and 5. Of course, it was a naval task force of the 4 countries to respond to the Indian Ocean tsunami. And it's been ad hoc. But you're talking about the Quad like it's a real feature of geopolitics and diplomacy in Asia now, it sounds like. And therefore has to be more deliberate about coordinating with ASEAN chairs and so forth. So you think it's here to stay, the Quad?
I think so. I think so, because at least I was wondering, when we had our presidential election, the Trump administration had been kind of keen on the Quad, and then the Biden administration came in, and I think everyone was wondering, well, what will the approach be? And then for the Biden administration immediately to go to this leaders summit involving the Quad, I think answers the question quite emphatically that this administration is committed to the Quad. So I think it's fantastic. I think it's just dripping with opportunities. But I think playing that inside game with ASEAN, and particularly the chairs, will be a very smart way for the Quad to advance whatever it decides its agenda is. Because ASEAN is looking for these other partners, right? I mean, all of the Quad members are already important partners for ASEAN. But the risk for the Quad is if they announce something big that hasn't been socialized with ASEAN first, right? Like the Australian mistake, that Asia Pacific community concept. The Quad can't do that. That would be the misstep the Quad could make. But there's no reason the Quad should make that. I think as long as we talk to each other and we talk to ASEAN, especially the chairs, we can easily stay away from that misstep. And here's the other thing is, if the Quad has some great ideas, some great initiative that it wants to roll out, why not socialize it first with the chair for a particular year? Why not socialize it first with Indonesia for 2023, for example, and let Indonesia roll it out, and then the Quad can step up and say, yes, we'll support that.
Terrific. Moez, do you want to start us off with the second question?
Second question. So I was really interested in this kind of perspective I saw throughout the presentation, this kind of nuanced approach Brunei had towards dealing with this major challenge of China. And remember, Brunei is the smallest claimant state to the South China Sea. So I find its kind of engagement particularly intriguing. So, uh, just your kind of thoughts more generically, has Brunei kind of figured it out? I mean, have they maybe more so than their other ASEAN neighbors really shown how you can have interest with the United States, have cooperation with the US and other powers, of course, a defense cooperation with Britain, which we didn't even get into, but still kind of pursue a relation with China that's interest based, in their case, specifically on economic issues, for example, where, other Western powers, other Western banks and companies may just simply just not have the market to operate in. So is there something other ASEAN countries can learn from Brunei in this engagement? And maybe also the United States, by the way.
Right. Well, I do think Brunei does it very well. I wouldn't. I'm not suggesting that the Bruneians have it all figured out or that they're the best and we all need to learn from Brunei. Brunei's challenge is because it is a small country, they don't have that many people who, in any area, who have deep experience and who really know how to do it. Their top people are fantastic, but they just don't have that many people to throw at problems. In many ways, I would say that Brunei is a bit similar in some to Singapore in that regard, where they're dealing with this problem of a small population, but so they have to make up for it to some degree with effective leadership and being smart in terms of how to pursue its policies. But so I think Brunei and Singapore are quite similar in that regard. But I don't think they're unique at all within ASEAN. I think that the Vietnamese, for example, have figured this out. These Bill Hari quotes that I wove into my presentation, where I was talking about Vietnam leaders and that ability to get along with China and that ability to stand up to China or not being a leader. So I think the Vietnamese get it too. And I think there are actually a number of countries in ASEAN that understand that nuanced approach. But I do think that the rest of us kind of have to figure that out because, in our own strategic debate, there is that whole question of, are we cooperating with China or are we competing or are we confronting, and it's obviously got to be both. And I think we can learn a lot from the Southeast Asians in that regard.
We have a couple, thanks, Moez, a couple of great questions. I don't know if you can see them, Ambassador Shields. The first one's from John Brandon. I assume that's John Brandon from the Asia Foundation. And he asks, if you can't see it, I'll just summarize. For ASEAN to have centrality, it needs to be relevant. And should ASEAN be thought of more as an instrument than just, being intrinsically important like Japan and the EU? So how do you think of the instrumentality of ASEAN?
Right.
And second, climate change. What's the agenda and what's John
Right.
Kerry's role in this?
Yes. Okay, great. So yes, I do agree that for ASEAN to have centrality, it needs to be relevant. But my own view is it is very relevant. It's relevant, in part just because of its own weight. It's 600 million people. It's economic dynamism. I think all of those factors, but also that convening power that it has as the chair. So I think ASEAN's highly relevant. I wouldn't I wouldn't use the term instrumentality. I mean, in the sense that I don't think that we should be looking at ASEAN as an instrument that we use. I think it should be more of a process of really consulting carefully with ASEAN, understanding what their agenda is, and again, that basically means the chair because the secretariat isn't able to drive it, and then finding those areas where we can cooperate, and also planting the seed with future chairs to try to advance the agenda. Okay, so
what do we do? Can I ask you real quickly to
please.
follow up on that, Dan? What do we do when we have, since it's a consensus-oriented forum, an organization,
Right.
what do we do when you have countries like Cambodia that in 2016 essentially get co-opted by China? I was in Phnom Penh that summer. I was living in Cambodia that summer. And the Cambodians said very publicly, hey, the Chinese gave us over $600 million. Sorry.
Right.
So is there anything we
Yes.
can do to prevent that sort of Achilles heel of the ASEAN way from really turning it from a asset, or at least an important engagement, into a liability?
Right. My own view, and you've really put your finger on a huge problem and a huge weakness of ASEAN, is that ability, given the emphasis on consensus, that ability of outside powers to use that process against ASEAN, prevent ASEAN from taking action. But I think the danger for U.S. and other policymakers is to kind of give up on ASEAN. To just these guys, they're too hard, they're too slow, we just can't do things with them. I find lots of times it doesn't really work that way. It's one of these games that doesn't really end. So like Cambodia, I'm not ready to write Cambodia off. I was a Cambodia desk officer back in the glory days when we were reestablishing diplomatic relations with those guys. Now you've seen it, take this very negative turn. But I don't think the story's over there. I think that Cambodia might change. And there's this interesting press report recently about Cambodia possibly scaling back some of its military cooperation with China, for example. Is that some kind of signal to the Biden administration? I don't know. But I don't think we should give up on them, even the difficult ones, particularly Cambodia, maybe Laos. I think we should keep trying. But if, let's say they are too hard, let's say we do try, we just can't get anywhere with those countries within ASEAN. There's always another year. You find the next chair. Okay, you can't work with Cambodia, then start talking to Indonesia and try to tee it up the following year. I think that would be the best approach.
Play the long game.
Yes.
Can you see the questions, Dan?
Let's see. Yeah.
If you can go ahead and pick the ones you want to answer.
Okay, great.
And I'll just intervene in about 4 or 5 minutes.
Okay, great. So I'm looking at the one from Maria Jose Flores, and it's about shifting the center of commercial tensions toward the other region. So yeah, I think that China is very much interested in diversifying its economic presence. It certainly wants a leading role in the region in Southeast Asia. I think a lot of this question really reminds me a lot of the RCEP issue, right? The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So, with ASEAN's move to have the RCEP, it got a lot of attention, and I think there's a sense of, oh, here's something where China's in the middle of it, and the United States is out, and India's out, and they're really missing the boat, and that kind of thing. But my own view is that RCEP without India actually isn't that big a deal, right? Because there's such a web of existing free trade agreements between the RCEP countries. So it was really only when you added India to the mix that RCEP became very interesting in terms of opening up new markets. So I think in many ways, India is the key to this. And so I think having that discussion with India, whether it's through Quad channels or the ASEAN-India discussion, I think that's where that issue is likely to be shaped. Okay, let's look at the next one. Look at Hazen Williams. Okay, so this is about plan of action, policy shifts, and so I think that there will be. I think inevitably the Biden administration is going to put its own stamp on the plan of action, and you're right. It is a challenge, because ASEAN likes to have these long-term plans, and then when you have an election in a country like the United States, everything shifts. But I think there are certainly elements in the POA where there will be continuity. I mean, frankly, I don't see any dramatic shifts in terms of U.S. engagement in ASEAN from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. I'm sure there will be differences in nuance, but the Biden administration will put its own stamp on it. But I don't see a radical discontinuity. Okay, next question, Chris Wagner. What could the EU learn from ASEAN? So I am in no way an EU expert, but I do think that ASEAN's frustratingly slow pace and way of doing things, in some ways, has been proven, by things like Brexit, right? If you want to draw the parallel with the EU, the tortoise and the hare, right? And ASEAN's definitely the tortoise in that analogy, but they have been steady. And there is the view that ASEAN isn't very relevant, doesn't mean very much, but I think if you step back and look at what it's done since 1967, it's actually a pretty impressive accomplishment. And to me, the big accomplishment is what it's done in terms of, let's say, mainland Southeast Asia, right? In terms of integrating Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia into ASEAN, shifting them from the battlefield to the marketplace, it's a pretty big accomplishment. And I think ASEAN deserves a lot of the credit for that. Myanmar, it hasn't worked yet. Myanmar, it's still struggling. But maybe in the future that ASEAN will be successful there. I think that's where ASEAN is kind of stuck right now. Is this question of fully integrating Myanmar into the organization. But anyhow, I do think that that's a significant accomplishment. Okay, next question, Chin Mei. So ASEAN views China as more influential. lot of trade, right? So how should the U.S. address the issue? So, right, I mean, I think that there is a lot more economic engagement right now between China and ASEAN than there is the U.S. and ASEAN. Although, of course, there's still an awful lot of U.S. Foreign direct investment in ASEAN. So in that regard, I think the U.S. Role is comparable, and I believe still greater than China's role in ASEAN. But I think the United States needs to step up its game in terms of economic engagement with ASEAN. A number of us worked on the TPP negotiations, and when that went down in flames, I think it was a setback for U.S. engagement with ASEAN. But I don't think it's time to stop. I think we need to explore new ways to deepen economic engagement between the United States and ASEAN, whether that means bilateral FTAs, as the Trump administration kind of focused on these bilateral approaches. I think the Biden administration will be more open to multilateral approaches. I doubt we'll specifically see the United States rejoining the CPTPP. But I don't know. I'm not an expert on U.S. domestic politics, and that's really largely a political question. But I think the Biden administration just has to find ways to step up U.S. Economic engagement with ASEAN. Okay, from Andreka Nataragawa. So how might recent developments in Myanmar impact the U.S. relationship with ASEAN? Yeah, so this, as I mentioned in the presentation, this is the biggest challenge, absolutely, for U.S. ASEAN engagement, because the United States is not going to want to sit down with military leaders in Myanmar, and ASEAN will want the United States and all its allied partners to engage ASEAN as a whole. So that's the basic challenge. I think right now the ball is very much in ASEAN's court to see what they can do to push for change. I've been a bit surprised to the upside by how outspoken some of the ASEAN countries that are generally quiet have been on this issue. This is certainly not a good thing for ASEAN if you see this reversal away from civilian government in Myanmar. So I think ASEAN needs to push hard to bring Myanmar back into the fold of civilian government, so that the U.S. ASEAN engagement and other engagement with ASEAN can reach its full potential.
Great questions and nice, concise, to the point answers, Dan. Thank you. We're at time, but hope to get you back to Georgetown in person when that's possible. Moyes is graduating, or so he thinks, in a couple months. So we need another resident Brunei expert. But when we get one, Moyes, get to work on that. When we get one of our next Brunei expert, we'll connect him with you and hope to get you down in person next time to talk about Southeast Asia. It really is the fulcrum in U.S.-China strategic competition, and the last thing that ASEAN countries want to be is the fulcrum in U.S.-China strategic competition. So it takes a really nuanced appreciation of the dynamics and of the member states one by one. And as Woody Allen said, 9/10 of success in life is just showing up. That might be a good description for how you succeed in ASEAN. But you have to have a long game. You have to have an eye on. You mentioned Cambodia. Cambodia is a very young country. In surveys, Cambodians have an incredibly positive view of the U.S. So there's a lot to work with over the long run. I don't know. Maybe last word from you. I've done a lot of surveying of Southeast Asia at CSIS. It's very hard to do surveys in Brunei.
Wow.
So I don't really have a feel for how Bruneians look at the United States. Maybe you can end by telling us that, and we'll let people get back to class and everything. But how do you think Bruneians look at the U.S.? Cambodians are incredibly positive when you look at surveys.
Yes.
In the Philippines, they love us, and by the way, sometimes they hate us. Thailand probably has the most complicated and in many ways negative view of America. But how do Bruneians look at us? I don't really have a sense for that.
So I think the view of the United States and Brunei is quite positive. I haven't really been back. The last time I was there was 2017 when I was out at US ASEAN. So I did travel back to Brunei to visit them. What I found is that Bruneians in general, and young Bruneians in particular, I think do have a positive image of the United States. The thing about Brunei, like a lot of Southeast Asian countries, is that they're very social media savvy. You know, they're intense social media users. So there's a lot of information out there about, you know, good and bad about the United States, but the Bruneians are quite plugged in. And I also think that the younger generation, you know, not just in Brunei, but in all around the region, they're incredibly dynamic. I was just blown away working with this YSEAN group when I was out at ASEAN in 2017. And as you're saying, it's not just the countries you would expect, where you have these young, tech savvy, dynamic people. You know, Cambodia, unbelievable young people participating in the YSEAN summits. So I really, of course, that's a selected group. But I'm pretty optimistic. You know, I really have a lot of optimism about the region. I think that people in the region are looking for the United States, India, other partners to step up. They want to have a lot of friends around the world, and I think we need to step forward and respond to that desire in the region to have continued U.S. and other engagement.
Well, in the history of our master's program in Asian studies, we've had close to 300 people graduate. Best GPA are one student from Brunei. So we want more students from Brunei. Definitely.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Look forward to having you in person next time. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Moez. Cheers, Dan. Thanks.